So now I'm going to be talking about my professors that I had at UCLA in the professional screenwriting program from 2005 to 2006. Before I went to UCLA, and before I graduated Marymount College in May of 2005, I had applied to grad schools and for screenwriting, and only UCLA interviewed me in March of that year. And I was interviewed on the East Coast because they said, do you want to interview on campus, or do you want to interview on the East Coast in New York City at the Lucerne Hotel? And I said, well, I've never flown on a plane. New York is only a 2-hour drive away. I'll go to New York. So it was on spring break, I believe, of that year, of 2005, in March, maybe the second week, the third week or whatever. And I went to the Lucerne Hotel in New York City, or Manhattan, I think New York, and I drove there with my parents, and the two professors that were interviewing the students were Hal Ackerman and Richard Walter, and I interviewed with Richard Walter, who I believe was the head of the screenwriting program at UCLA's film school in the screenwriting department. So I met with him that day. It was a weekday. I think it was maybe a Thursday or Friday. I don't know what day. It was either Monday through Friday, one of those days. And he was sitting in the room. It was a little hotel room, like just a living room area. He sat down in a chair. I had a chair. And he goes, okay, tell me about yourself. What did you write to get in? And I told him I wrote a soap opera, kind of like Melrose Place, set by the ocean. And I was telling him about it. And he goes, oh, I remember that. I remember reading that. And then he said, what's your favorite film and why? And I believe I said Forrest Gump, and all the, the irony in it, all the people he met over the years and what he did, all the famous things he got to see and do. And then he talked about he goes, what were your parents like growing up? Where did you live? And I told him I'm from Lawrence, Massachusetts. It's a mill city. My parents were factory workers, very hard workers. My dad's an immigrant from Sicily. And that was basically about it. And then he said, if you don't get into the MFA, I tell all my interviewees this, if you don't get into the MFA program, there's a professional program. And I told him I saw about that online a few weeks ago when I was researching on UCLA. He said, if you don't get into the MFA, there's a 1-year certificate program. You have to have your bachelor's degree. Apply to that if you don't get in. And most likely, everybody who interviewed will have the upper hand in getting into that, who interviewed for the MFA. He said, we got to see who's getting in first. He says, it's very selective. We only admit between maybe, say, 20, 25 people per year. And most of those people come from that program. So if you don't get in, just don't feel bad. You're one of the best of the best. Everybody who made this interview, we only interview 50 per year. Just about that. And you're one of the 50, and you're one of the best of the best. So don't feel bad. Even if you don't get in, you are invited to apply to that program. And most likely you will get in, and you will have upper hand in other people who did not interview for the MFA. So I didn't get into the MFA program, but I applied again to the professional one. And on June 13th, after I had graduated Marymount College, I went to the mailbox. I believe it was on June 13th. Opened the mailbox, and there was my acceptance into the professional program. So when I began the professional program that fall of 2005, when I was going to my workshop class, I believe, one night, at the very beginning, I ran into Professor Walter in the hallway, and he looks at me, I look at him, and he goes, hi! I'm like, hey, Professor Walter, how you doing? Great seeing you again. And he goes, you made it here, didn't you? I'm like, yeah. And he goes, wow, congratulations. He goes, God bless you. Very, very nice guy. And he spoke the truth. He said, it's very selective to get into to the MFA program. They only accept very few per year. And most of the people that get in are from that program, the professional program, because the faculty knew them. Whether they were class of 2004, 3, 2, 1, 2000, the program had been around for a few years then. Maybe, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 years, who knows? And if anyone applied that was in that program, they get the upper hand over people who just graduated from college. And then in the fall of 2005, it was the very beginning of October, I believe. Everybody was invited to the lecture class, the very first lecture class with Hal Ackerman. Hal Ackerman had been professor at UCLA of screenwriting for many years, just like Professor Richard Walter. And Professor Ackerman was the lecture teacher. He lectured once a week in Haynes Hall, which is right next door to Royce Hall, in the heart of UCLA, by the stairs over there. And, sometimes people didn't even go to class. It was just a lecture. They never took attendance. He never took attendance. So I remember I went to most of the lectures, but like in 2006, before we all graduated from there, I didn't go to all of them. I went to like most of them. Very nice professor. I remember on the first day of class, he goes, "What's that serenity prayer?" And then I raised my hand and I told him, because I remember hearing about it in Professor, what's her name? Ms. Murnane's class in health in Central Catholic. God grant me the serenity to accept things that cannot change, courage to change things that cannot, the courage to change things that cannot, something like that. God grant me the serenity to accept the things that cannot change, the courage to change the things that can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And he's like, wow, that's great. That's definitely it. So that was like the first thing he asked in class, and I remembered that. And then he'd always talk about like the note cards, like make note cards when you do your scripts, like have them on a wall and everything. My style of writing, I never use note cards. I always wrote down everything on a computer, like step by step what I was gonna do. Like the Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, the midpoint, the climax, the low point, the resolution, all that stuff. And I'd do it like that. I would never use the note cards or anything on walls. So that was Professor Hal Ackerman. Very nice guy, very friendly, very nice guy. And then my first workshop professor, we met once a week with him, was Paul Chitlik. And Paul Chitlik was amazing. He was the best professor I had there. It was the first workshop class I had. We had to write a screenplay, a full-length screenplay, and it took 2 semesters to do that in. The first semester, we wrote Act 1, and then the second semester, which was in the new year, I believe we wrote Act 2 and 3 in the first couple of months of 2006. And that class was a riot. Oh my gosh, there was me, there was a girl named Kelly from Phoenix, Arizona, there was a girl named Ginny from England, there was a guy named TJ about my age from Chicago, a guy named Tom around my age from Boston, a guy named Will around my age from, I think, Philly. Then there was Dan. He was from Oregon, I believe. Seattle area, I think. Around that area in the West Coast, Upper West Coast. And he was maybe a good 7, 8 years older than me. And then there was Ryan from near the OC area. And he was also a good 7 or 8 years older than me as well. And I think they both, out of everyone in the class, they both had experience in screenwriting. They had taken courses before or something years ago. And there was so much humor with me and Ryan. Ryan was a horror writer, a screenwriter specializing in horror scripts. And he had placed so many times in so many different screenwriting competitions. He'd always win first place or whatever. And he was the most knowledgeable screenwriter and the best one out of all of us in the class. And each week we'd bring in our pages, about 10 pages or so, of our scripts, and we'd read them. We'd assign each of us to read a character or characters or the dialogue or whatever, and the action. and I'd be doing all these voices, and Ryan would be cracking up, and I'd be cracking up. And then Paul was like, "Mark, those voices you do, oh my gosh, you should get into voice acting." And I said, "I don't have an agent." So he goes, "Go out and get one." And he told me, Mark, while you write, there's very few people that are going to be successful, big screenwriters, of SAG-AFTRA productions, SAG-AFTRA television and film. While you write, act. Go out and get an agent. You'll be great at acting while you write. And you're definitely going to get into the acting faster because it's much easier to get into the acting than it is for the writing. And Ryan agreed. Ryan said, Mark, if I need a toady in my films, I'm going to cast you. You're not a lead. You are a character actor. And you'd be a great toady for the main villain to tag along with. And my first screenplay was a comedy. It was a teenage comedy. And I met with Paul at the end of the semester, the second semester, before we passed the full screenplay in. And he said, Mark, I love this screenplay. It's a lot like Napoleon Dynamite, the characters, but they're real. It's so funny, the screenplay, what you wrote. The characters are real, though. They actually have emotions, unlike the characters of Napoleon Dynamite. These characters are actually real characters that have real emotions. They're not just some made-up kooky characters. They're actually real characters that are funny at times. So that was my class with Paul Chitlik. And Paul Chitlik, he wrote episodes of 1980 shows. He didn't write many of them, the ones I loved. He wrote mostly the new Twilight Zone. And he wrote episodes of Small Wonder. He wrote, I believe, an episode of Perfect Strangers, an episode of Who's the Boss, and an episode of Amen. And those were all mid-1980 shows, sitcoms. And that was the first professor I took. I checked off I wanted to have a professor such as either him or Fred Rubin or someone who wrote sitcoms or wrote television. Because I wanted to do television. I love film, but I wanted to do television mostly. So that was my first class I took with Paul Chitlik. And then my second workshop class, in which I wrote my second screenplay, within 3 months' time, between March and June, was with Fred Rubin. And Fred Rubin is one of the big players from the 1980s and 1990s, early mid-90s. He wrote so many different sitcoms. Starting off, when he started in the late 70s, he wrote, early 80s, he wrote Archie Bunker's Place, the season premiere of season 2. I think it was the second part of it, where it was explained Edith Bunker had passed away. So he's famous for writing how she died. Well, the episode that explains that what happened, how Archie found her in bed one morning, passed away, and his feelings from that. And he also wrote, the first couple of seasons of Different Strokes. He wrote, I believe he was the one who wrote the line, "What are you talking about, Willis?" I believe he said he wrote that. And then when Gary Coleman said it, he goes, "What you talk about, Willis? What you talk about, Willis?" Willis, as you know, was played by Todd Bridges, and that's the guy who had a crush on my ex-girlfriend Kim when Niecy Nash tried to introduce them online. So, and Fred wrote episodes of Mama's Family. He wrote episodes of Webster. He wrote episodes of Family Matters, Step by Step, Two of a Kind, and he produced some of them as well. And he wrote a lot of different shows between the early to late 80s and early into the 90s. And he even had a line, I believe he played a caballero in Family Matters. Like when Steve Urkel and Carl and everyone, they went to Mexico for something, I think. He had one line toward I think the end of the episode as a caballero. I'm not sure if they cut the scene in syndication or not, but in full episodes on DVD and streaming services, he's there online. He had a line or so as that. And in his class, I wrote a action drama. And Fred would get kind of concerned with me. He'd say, "Mark, I think you know this screenplay by heart. I think you wrote it in advance." I'm like, "I didn't. It's a topic I wrote down that I had in mind before I took the class." Because in the summer of 2005, I wrote down what I wanted to write for my 2 screenplays. I'm like, I want to write this, I want to write that, and that's it. And the first screenplay I wrote was the comedy, the sitcom. I mean, the comedic coming of age comedy, teen comedy, and the second one was going to be the action drama. And he goes, yeah, well, I think you wrote this ahead of time because you know everything about it. I'm like, if you think that, am I going to still get my certificate? And he's like, yeah, you're all right. But I think you wrote this ahead of time. I'm like, Fred, I just know the details of, like, specifics of it. I don't know the story. I made the story up as I went along in the class. A certain aspect of it I was familiar with, just like I was with my first screenplay. I knew a lot about aspects because I lived it. And this aspect is something, a certain aspect wasn't part of the actual, like, plot, but it was, like, just there. And he goes, well, I think you know, like, all about it. I'm like, well, yeah, because, you know, you write what you know. But I'm writing it as I go along. So he goes, Mark, something about the screenplay, though, is that it's a big world that you're talking about. And there's so much more you could write in. Like, you're writing it, but there's so much more you can do with it. So I'm like, it could be like a television series. And he goes, yeah, there's so much more you can do. Like, there's so many ways you can go about it. And when we read our characters, he also told me, he goes, Mark, those are funny voices you do. And he would tell me and the class, like, certain things about Hollywood. Like, when Carol O'Connor passed away, Archie Bunker, he was one of the select few people that was invited to his funeral. And he told me, I said, I love Give Me a Break. I said, that was my favorite sitcom of the early 80s. And he said, you know, my wife, Marley wrote the first theme song. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. And I was kind of like joking with him. I'm like, I like the later seasons theme song better, which is true, but I'm like, I like both of them. But the later theme song was like my favorite, you know, Give Me a Break, now I know what it takes. So that was a fun fact about Fred. And he was a funny professor, very humorous, a lot of laughs in his class. And yeah, that was my second professor. And he just said my screenplay, like, and he gave me good advice too. He said, when you write dialogue, write up to 4 lines. And then if you have 4 lines, try to get it down to 2. If you have 2, try to get it down to 1. Because, like, people will write so much dialogue per character, per, like, dialogue section. Like, they'd be rambling on one sentence, and they go rambling and rambling and rambling and rambling and rambling and rambling. Oh, just break it down more. Less is more. And other than that, he said my screenplay had a lot of potential to be in a more than it was. Like, it's such a big world. So, yeah, and that was my second class with Fred Rubin. And he was a great professor as well.